Welcome to the Einstein Forum. I'm trusting that people can see me, although it's not entirely clear to myself. I'm Susan Neiman. I'm the director of the Einstein Forum, and I wish I were welcoming you to the beginning of our annual board conference. We have a wonderful board of advisors from various places and disciplines, among whom are Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. And originally this evening was planned live. I've been chewing for the last 3 months on an Irish sentence: if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Here we are, nevertheless. I am not going to announce all the titles and books and publications of Ivan and Stephen. If you don't know that they published a much discussed book this year, or last year, I guess, you probably wouldn't be here. But I'd like to begin instead by asking a little bit about the development of their thoughts about these questions and some personal questions. I want to ask each of them where they were in 1989, what they were thinking about, how they were engaged in these kinds of transformations, what hopes weren't realized. Ivan, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. It is not difficult to remember. So 1989, I was last year student in philosophy in the Sofia University. And it was kind of an incredible time on many occasions. If you're going to ask me what I remember, honestly speaking, what I remember is the speed. Because people try to remember basically what they have been thinking. I don't believe that really I can tell you what I have been thinking when all this was happening, because first, in Bulgaria, it came much more as a surprise than in many other places. Unlike Poland and like many other places, Bulgaria did not have this type of a political life. The opposition was very weak. So November 10, just a day after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Bulgarian communist leader Todor Zhivkov resigned after more than 40 years in power. And I'm just going to give you one aspect in order to imagine how the idea of the time has been changed. So after this happened, there was a restaurant in the Sofia University, and some of us have been staying there. And then came the person who 6 months later was the first democratic president of Bulgaria, Zhelev, who then was our best known dissident. And he was very excited, of course, and he said to us, "You young people, in your lifetime, you're going to see the end of communism." It was November 1989. 6 months later, 7 months later, he was the president of the country. So what is going to stay with me is exactly this story that it's not that you're doing history, but history is doing you. And being a young person at this moment was, of course, a huge advantage.
Can you think back to what you looked forward to in thinking, okay, you're going to see the end of communism? It came much faster than anybody expected. What kind of a society did you envision?
Well, listen, part of the story, and I do believe also part of the story of us writing this book, is that, at least in my case, it was very much the story that we have been telling. This was the idea of the West, but this was the idea of the West, at least, of people who have never visited the West. I have not been visiting the West back then. So at the same time, of course, what we have been seeing was also very much rooted in history, because after 1985, after Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, there was a really incredible discussion about what happened in the Soviet period, in the communist period, and others. So from this point of view, there was this clash between the abnormality of communism and the idea of a normality, which was very much perceived as the Western society. And of course, for different people, what was exactly good about Western society were different things, but there was one general idea, and there were two, in fact. One is that everybody was interested to cross the border and to see what this is about. So getting out was very strong and very important. And also not simply getting out of the borders of the country, but don't forget that in Bulgaria in the 1989, there was a residence rule. So you cannot decide, for example, to start living in Sofia. you should have a basically permission to do this. So this kind of a movement itself, that you basically can decide where you want to live and what to do. And secondly, there was an illusion that was very well spread, I do believe, all over. And the idea was that we in Eastern Europe are kind of very well developed societies, very well developed economies, and it's going to take us 5 or 10 years, and we're basically going to be on the economic level of the West. So probably we're not going to be Germany, but we're going to be Austria. So there was also there was something very exciting and intellectual sense about this period. And the most interesting was that you have this 6 weeks or 6 months in which everybody, I mean, totally ordinary people, started dealing with the philosophical questions. You have the feeling that you're not living in a society, but you're basically present at the seminar of the philosophy department of the university. People started asking really basic questions. And this is something that I do believe is going to stay with me from particularly these early days, 1989, 1990.
So the idea of normality plays a huge role in parts of your book. Stephen, normal must have seemed very different coming from where you were coming from. I wonder how you put that together.
Well, so 1989, I just turned 41. I had spent my life in a world divided between the communist world and the free world. So, I mean, one thing I think also very shared, and part of the fun of writing this book together with Ivan is that we saw this collapse from 2 different angles. It was, I think, for us too, for me too, it was as if the pyramids had dissolved overnight. So how could something that seems so solid and just collapse? It had, it's not exactly euphoria, but there was a thrill that I experienced also wanting to cross over. Of course, I had been, say, to East Berlin in the late 60s, and it was a very memorable experience. But this was a completely different moment with particularly what sticks in my mind is the enthusiasm of the young people to talk. That is, this desire, you could talk across what had been a barrier, a great barrier of freedom. And I met, so many brilliant, here's one of brilliant young people whose desire, who had lived in a way walled off. And once that wall came down, that wall distance, wanted to tell you everything about their lives and their world. And it was just a thrill to hear them. And I remember I had studied Russian before, but just the power of the Russian language was so intense at the time because they were talking really freely to people with whom they'd never been able to talk freely. I think that's, there are many other things, but I particularly think this sense of the enthusiasm of the young and the fact that there's a chasm that had been bridged suddenly. We didn't know it. It was like a little bit also like Ivan said, there was a feeling of being Darwin, as if your skin is taken off and you have to see how a liberal order could be remade. And it made you question yourself as well. So how did we get the way we are? Once you saw societies not really prepared without any, because democracy is a tiny spot in human history and it has lots of preconditions. And when you try to create it, then all of a sudden those things that are preconditions for it working come into visible view. So that was also a kind of very a strong, and I think in the early 90s, it was before we realized some of the limits of the capacity of the East to import Western models. Before we really understood that, we were more thinking of of the way Ivan said, that in a few years this is going to work, this will catch on. It's an amazing illusion that how it can appear even later, even after the collapse of the hopes of post-communist societies. And for example, in the Arab Spring, people were thinking this can happen like that, as societies that have lived in a different way can suddenly, once you go out on the street, create a multi-party democracy with a liberal system and so on.
Susan, there is one point which is important for me, and this is the following. Particularly in Bulgaria, East Germany was different. But this was also the idea of the West was very much the idea of the readers. It was not the visual. We were not seeing the television. Of course, there were films, but there was much more control. So at the same time, basically, many of us have been reading English, or at least we believing that we're speaking some English, which was not exactly the case. But the interesting story is that as a result of it, it was really a very strong work of imagination. And I'm always going to remember an article that I read in the late 1980s by a famous Soviet translator. I do believe it was a Faulkner, who said, I have been translating Faulkner all my life. I have never been visiting the United States. I have never been leaving the Soviet Union. So he said, in moments of depression, I had the suspicion that the West does not exist. All these books are written somewhere in the propaganda department because basically communism was needed the enemy. And I'm saying this because this is very important. It was the reader's imagination. It was not this visual world in which we're living now, where even if you're not going somewhere, you basically are very much visually there.
Right.
I want to add something to this because this is there's a parallel experience in the West, which is that I found, I mean, I was studying political theory, political science, and so on, and there were, of course, departments of Russian studies, Soviet studies in the United States, and the people who directed those centers of Soviet studies had never been to Russia, ever. Now their students, all of a sudden, their graduate students are traveling all around Russia, interviewing mayors about the car factory in their town and so on. So suddenly you had this gap between the professoriate, who was supposed to be directing the PhD theses, and the students. And so one of the reasons I got pulled into this is because I wasn't part of that old apparatchik-y, the old professoriate of Soviet studies, and I was more open, and I was traveling, of course, too. So it was the fact that I got pulled into post-communist studies is because I wasn't actually trained in communist studies, which was itself became a barrier at that time, because it actually was what do you want to call them? These are people who only read, I would put it that way.
I'm just trying to get my head around the idea that people might have formed their vision of the United States on Faulkner when, as you point out in the book, now they're forming it on House of Cards. Don't you say?
This is, you have also in the book, but this is a direct quote. There was a book by a Russian author about Kremlin, which is quoting that at the moment when Mr. Shoigu became the Minister of Defense of Russia, President Putin told him, and I know now everybody is going to brief you too much on the United States, don't waste time. It's enough to see the House of Cards.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so 30 years later, it becomes clear to everyone, and the two of you as well, that the kinds of hopes you and millions of others have had are going off the rails to some degree. I know you said that you originally began to write a book about Russia, and that the book evolved. But by the time you got it into the form that that we know it, who was your audience? What were you hoping to convey?
Let's start first, and for us this is very important because we have been talking and writing this book, because in a certain way this book came out of a lot of conversation for a long period of time. And first, Stephen wrote a very important, in my view, article in the mid-1990s that had a very strong impression on me, which was called "When Less State Does Not Mean Less Freedom." More freedom, sorry. And this was very much about the impact of the state weakness on freedom. So you ended up, for example, in Russia, in the situation in which police stopped beating people, but then the criminals started beating people. So if you're beaten, to be honest, it does not make a huge difference for you who is beating you. And I'm saying this because this was a book that was evolving, and the moment when we decided to come as a book project, it was around 2006, 2007, and our question was the following: could it be the Russia in the way we see it? And it was back then. It's telling something about the future. Everybody was at this moment interpreting what is happening in Russia, fake elections, basically huge economic disparity. You have basically a government that is not exploiting people, they're exploiting natural resources and just trying to neutralize people. Could it be that Russia is not coming from the past, that Russia is coming from the future? Could it be basically that we can see in some of the things that we see in Russia, the future of the West? And we went with this book proposal. To be honest, you're a very sophisticated editor who said, listen, it's very interesting, but it's slightly too much. And the funny story was that in 2016 or 17, if we had went with this book proposal to the same editor, I do believe his response was going to be, but is it not too obvious? So in a certain way, we have been going there. And this was a conversation, at least for me, and I do believe the same for Stephen. This is not an angry book because people said, oh, do you believe that? Are you blaming here and there? We're not blaming because we have been part of this same type of intellectual journey. It's not the intellectual journey of somebody who have been outside and saying, we have been telling you all the time. At least in my case, I do believe that at least we went through all these illusions and in a certain way, all these ways to try to reconcile certain type of initial expectations of what we're seeing. So when we start writing, for us, the most important was what we're writing about. And we understood that we're writing about the history that has finished when we basically finished the book. At least this is my reading of it.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so leading question, the way the book in a way begins is to say, why is it that while in 1989, Central and Eastern Europe, which seemed to be the place that was most promising for the development of liberal democratic institutions and norms, has now become a hotbed of this populist, xenophobic, nativist, reactionary regimes. So how do you explain that change? So we have an explanation, but one of the things that struck me most in the reactions to our book is people, we have a very good friend at Central European University who's, I guess, just retiring, who said, how can you be apologizing for Viktor Orban and Kaczynski? So this seemed to be very shocking to Ivan and me, because it was like the idea that if you'd explain something, that means you're apologizing for it is a bit rather strange. That's an odd way to approach things, but I see why. Because as Ivan says, we're not angry. We aren't trying to write about these three cases of these anti-democratic, anti-liberal wave that seems to be taking over the world, and not just in the places we discussed, also, let's say, in Brazil, in India, and so forth. But we chose these three examples, Hungary, Poland, Russia, and the US, to try to explain why it happened, not to denounce it, to say, because it's not about a leader being perfidious or being an idiot like the President of the United States. It's about why the 35% of the public support him. Where is this well of support for Orban and Kaczynski even more? So how do you explain that? And one of the things just to get to the theme of the book, one of the things we noticed, at least in the Central European case, is that many of the spokesmen for Polish and Hungarian populism kept repeating this phrase: we are tired of being copies. We don't want to be imitators anymore. You're telling us we're kind of a crummy imitation of you, and we don't want to do that anymore. We want to be authentically ourselves. You hear this in East Germany too. That is why are we, you're stealing from us our history, our memory, and everything that goes wrong is because we're being taken over by some kind of foreign extraneous liberal democratic model that's not authentically us. So that gave us a clue that this, what we thought of as something benign or at least neutral, which is the process of democratization and liberalization, if you see it as a process of imitation, which of course implies a superior and an inferior, you can see why perhaps a politics of resentment would grow out of it. So that was a kind of a kernel of the idea at which we eventually arrived, trying, as I said, to find some kind of Ariadne's thread to take us through these different cases, because it is a story we're telling. It's not the only possible story. It's a way of thinking about these parallel pathological eruptions in a way that kind of shows that you can fit them together in a story.
So I have, I've tremendously enjoyed and learned from your book, But I have a couple of fundamental questions about it, that one of which would fit right here. I get the idea that people resent being asked to be a copy of someone else, especially if the emphasis is always, you're a bad copy, you're not a complete copy. But I wonder, first of all, where the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism is in your book. I would love to have a clearer distinction between those two things, because I wonder if it isn't a tremendous disappointment with neoliberalism in its most rapacious forms, as we have seen after '89, that hasn't also caused many people in Eastern Europe to say, this is not what we want. It's not what we thought we were in for. And moreover, the people who are telling us, that this is the model we ought to follow are not actually following their own model. They're corrupt in various ways. They don't fulfill the kinds of ideals they said they would. I just wonder if both of you could speak to that, because I'm missing the way that must play a role in the rejection of a Western model.
Let's start, because it's a great point. But don't forget, we started from the fact that when people were talking about the West, they had the feeling that they know what they were talking about, and they were not making a major differences. Seen from the West, there was a major difference between Federal Republic of Germany and the United States as the way to organize economy, in the way to organize society. Seen from the East, this was just the West. All these differences were not perceived as very important differences. And being an imitator creates three different problems during the transition. One is the basic problem Stephen was talking about. You're not simply a copy, but the model all the time is instructing you that you are not copying really well or praising you of doing this. And the process of European integration was very much about this. And this was kind of endorsed by people. It's not that it was imposed on us. So we were imitators by choice. So it was not imposition. For us, this is very important distinction. But secondly, there are two other things happened, exactly because the West was kind of an empty vessel in which people were putting different hopes. The West was very different for different people. There are some people who like this idea of a neoliberal economy. And as you know, in places like Poland and others, in the beginning, you have a much more support for this than in most of the West European countries. For people like Balcerowicz, in a certain way, being neoliberal was the only way to become a model for the Western Europe. Because the moment we're going to be more Americanized than Europeans who will stop to be copies, we're going to be the model where Germans will start to copy. But also for many conservative, for example, Poles, what they like about West was they believe it's a religious society, that it is about very traditional, that it is all these values, everything that you are lacking in communism. This is the most important. The image of the West was based on the knowledge of communism, and everything that people didn't like about communism, they were putting in this kind of an ideal West, including, for example, social inequality. In a certain way, communism was perceived as very unequal society, and because the West was just the opposite, people basically believe that it's a much more equal society.
Right.
Yeah, and then comes something which is very important, which started, in my view, with the global financial, it started with the war in Iraq, but this was much more kind of West European crisis than East European crisis, but it started with the global financial crisis and then developed. And this is not simply that you're an imitator, but could it be that you're imitating a wrong thing? At least we were told that we are basically imitating the future. And this is the very important in the transition narrative. Future was not anymore ahead of time. Future was next to us in space. If I want to go to the future, I simply should cross the border. And suddenly, you have this story, what about if we were cheated? If basically this was not the future. I remember reading years ago a study showing that around 7% of the people who went on the railway station in the last 5 minutes before their train jumping on the wrong train. So at some point psychologically, for many kind of East Europeans, basically you have the feeling that we arrived late on the railway station and we jumped on the wrong train. So this created also a huge resentment. It's not simply that you're lecturing us, but you are basically selling to us something that is in crisis.
Okay, so I would say you're half right that there's a really important to distinguish between liberalism and neoliberalism. And here's an example that would kind of confirm your intuition. In Hungary, which was a country without any private capital, they imitated a standard model Thatcherite idea of privatization. And the consequence was that the communist managers used the assets of their enterprises to privatize the patrimony of the country. And this, of course, created resentment, as you can imagine, because it was totally unfair. It created inequality that was totally unjustifiable. You had people who had been very good friends, a year before, and then one of them was riding around in a limousine and the other one couldn't afford a bus ticket and so on. So this created resentment. On the other hand, and that's a resentment particularly against liberalism, because liberalism's idea is that every abuse that you suffer is a violation of individual rights. But privatizing the public patrimony does not abuse individual rights. And not only that, it sacralizes the property rights, becomes a defense. Liberalism, which in all forms of liberalism, not just neoliberalism, private property is an important institution. So that, I think, confirms that this inequality, imitating privatization of Thatcherite style would be bad. But there are other things, and this is something that Ivan has written about brilliantly, that in 1989, the most vibrant, vital, palpable form of liberty that was offered to East Europeans was the freedom to leave their country. And the freedom that's not neoliberalism, that's freedom to travel, freedom to seek employment, freedom to go to exercise your trade. You're a doctor in Bulgaria, you're trained in Bulgaria. You can exercise your trade better in Munich, whatever this is. But today, because the hemorrhaging of young people, particularly talented, educated young people to the rest of Europe, is not experienced as freedom by people who live in these countries. They don't experience it that way. They can't see liberalism's valorization of the freedom to leave your country as like the highest value. They don't see that as interpreting their experience. So that's a problem with liberalism, which is not adequate to their experience, but it's not about neoliberalism. And then there are things about politics too, but I think that's a good example of the...
So here's a question to follow up on that one for both of you. There are two kinds of critique, obviously. There's a critique of certain liberal and or neoliberal ideals, which argues that a society or a nation is not living up to the ideals that it proclaims and that it ought to get its act together. But there's also, of course, critique that's sheer deconstruction in the attempt to undermine those ideals themselves. One of perhaps my favorite part of the book was your devastating discussion of the ways in which Trump has actually now imitated Putin. And I think you say Russians love Trump because he seems to prove that, yes, Western liberal capitalism is every bit as corrupt and vulgar as we always said it was. So you have this, you have one kind of critique that I think most of us still try to practice, that is trying to force this culture to retain, live up to, realize some of its ideals. And a critique that just simply says, no, they were all hollow to begin with, and there's nothing whatsoever that can be done to save them. I wonder if you could each speak a little bit about that question.
Listen, one of the interesting story when we have been doing Russia, even on the very early stage of our book, was total obsession with the hypocrisy of the West. So,
Right.
and this was the keyword. And by the way, this is also a keyword for Trump. This is the hypocrisy of the liberal establishment. So the Russians basically were saying, you're giving us a lessons, but it's not the real issue. What you're talking values, in fact, is basically interests. Paradoxically, this talk about hypocrisy created a strange situation in which Russians were trying to see the West as much more consistent and much more powerful and, to be honest, much more rational, because everything that they were seeing in the world, they were explaining as the success of the Western policies. For example, when you're telling to the Russian diplomats that the United States failed in Iraq, they're going to say, no, 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 they did not fail. They achieved what they wanted. And basically, this was basically to inject disorder, to inject chaos, and so on and so on. And I do believe, in a certain extent, to a certain extent, this is also part of the legacy of the late Soviet period, in which any talk about value was perceived as hypocritical.
This fascinates me, of course, given all the things that I...
Yeah, and this is interesting. I'm going to refer, because talking about also things that we're seeing these days in the United States, in Europe. I was reminded of a book of Huntington that basically nobody is reading anymore, but in 1975, he decided to make sense out of what happened in 1960, 68, both in the Eastern Bloc and in the United States. And he made a point which was quite interesting. He said, oh yes, of course it was a major turmoil, it was very tough, but in the same way it was a re-legitimation of the systems on both cases, because in both cases the system was attacked from the position of the ideals of the system. So the American students went on the street and said, this is not our America. This is not the America. This is not the American dream. And basically in Czechoslovakia, people started to talk about socialism with human face and so on. So interestingly enough, and I found this very important, in 1989, this was not anymore criticism from the point of view of the ideal. And this was the tragedy of Gorbachev, who probably was the only one who was still living in the 1968 type of a story. He still believed that he's criticizing from the point of view of the ideas. And I do believe that also what we see in the United States today is much more complicated. This is not about the American dream that people go about. It's about different idea of American identity and what American society is going to be about. So there is something very interesting about this. We have been making with Stephen this comparison with China, which I found quite important. In the late 1980s, both the Soviet and the Chinese leadership decided that socialism in the form in which it was does not work. But they took a totally different conclusion of what is worth saving. Gorbachev believed that what is worth saving is the socialist ideas, and what is the biggest problem is the monopoly of the communist power. The Chinese basically took the totally opposite conclusion. The only thing that is worth saving was the communist power and the monopoly of the power, because it can deliver, and what basically should be thrown out was the communist ideology. And this is this interesting story, and this is why hypocrisy and trying to the West don't stop talking us about values. We know about its interests. So when you talk to us about your interest as if you're talking values, you are humiliating us. You are in a certain way trying to show your kind of a privileged position.
So what I have found so puzzling for a very long time is you could make the same critique on both sides of the Cold War. You could say both of them failed to live up to the ideas that they were fighting for. And yet somehow or another in the West, there are still plenty of people who think, you know, depending on how radical you have to tinker, we can somehow recreate a better society according to liberal ideas, whereas I guess Gorbachev is still alive. So if you say he's the only one who thinks one might rebuild, there are a few other people, and I'm not averse to listening to them either, but it's a very, very small, still voice. So why did that voice collapse in Soviet Europe? Stephen, do you have any good ideas about that?
Well, I mean, this is kind of a counter I'm not sure, but I was thinking along slightly different lines, trying to reply to your question. Let me play that out, and then we'll see if I can come to the last question you asked. So about Putin being happy, I noticed, that's also true in China with Xi Jinping, people were very happy at the beginning to see Trump out there telling the police to beat up on protesters. And they were putting it on TV, look, and he's just like us. So that was like happiness in being imitated. And then something happened, which is the generals came out and defended the protesters, which they stopped putting on television at all. I was like, we're not showing generals defending protesters. That is like impossible. And that already has an element of what you're saying. There's an ideal there, which is the right to assemble, the right to protest, the right to express your grievances. You can't use police and rubber bullets and tear gas. And then the emptiness, and this again, it very much is if we're trying to see how our analysis fits to the present moment. Part of the obsession, the Trumpian belief that everything is hypocrisy, that there are no values, that everything is clashing interests, brought him and his supporters to the idea that every statement of fact dissolves into a declaration of political affiliation. So I'm just really basically, when I say something like Obama's not born in America, whatever, that just means I'm in this party, I'm in the Trump party, which has led to this unbelievable extreme of saying that wearing a mask is a political attack on Trump. So that's how far he has gone in denying that there's something like a real world that you have to deal with outside of political ideology. I think that's such a dead end, you see, he's brought to. I think that's the thing that's being, just let me say a couple more words about this. What's been preoccupying me most in these days is exactly this, the place we've been brought by this almost nihilistic denial that there are any values to which we should be aiming, which we should use to criticize ourselves. And as Ivan and I write in the book, there is a way in which the West fell in love with itself after '89, thinking it didn't have an enemy, there was no alternative. All of history should be leading up to us. That kind of idea is not good for your self-critical faculties. And I think a lot of our self-critical faculties kind of fell asleep with the sense of, well, we won, and there's no alternative to us. But what's happened today, this is here's like the detail, and we can try to elaborate on that. That Trump has been trying to find his footing after the pandemic because all of his language of 2016 is gone. He can't talk about trade. No one cares about it. He can't talk about migration. No one cares about it. He can't say he's closing the borders that are already closed. He can't say that the white working class is the most aggrieved group in society. Obviously, we've seen not. And so he decided, this is amazing, he decided he was going to recreate his identity around defying the lockdown. Okay, and then George Floyd was murdered, and all these people defied the lockdown, went out on the street against him. So this was a kind of, so that completely turned him upside down. And if you've noticed, the plague, the pandemic, destroyed the rally, but it didn't destroy the protests. I mean, somehow that's like, this is a kind of, so the environment turns out to be one in which it's very uncomfortable for him because, of course, it's something you can't just turn into, you can't just say Dr. Fauci is a hypocrite or whatever. You can't say people who are trying to tell you something factual are just deceiving you or are manipulating you. And this is very clear that the Republican coalition, he's losing the mayors, the Republican mayors, the Republican governors who have to deal with the disease because for him, it's all pure performing. It's public image. And of course, they have to deal with real reality there.
So
I didn't answer your question, but
go ahead.
I'm saying I mean, that's just a way I've been thinking. I think that's kind of, I'd like to hear Ivan too, because he's written about this now, how we think about the whole framework we've developed. And just one last thing there about the generals and so on. It's a very important part of the politics of imitation that regimes like Xi Jinping's and Putin's, they're afraid that their people will imitate protests elsewhere. They're afraid, like a fear of Hong Kong, fear. This is, Putin was fear of Maidan. Why? Because of imitation. So imitation is still a dangerous thing, even for regimes that don't want to imitate. They're afraid that people in their own society, and you can see the George Floyd protests have metastasized all over the world. They have struck a chord everywhere. And this is partly related to your point, that is, there's something about this idea of protest, remembering oppression, white supremacy, or versions of it from the age of imperialism have survived everywhere. And it has a resonance, it has a strong resonance. And the fact that even after Trump, people want America to actually be important in their lives. And what's important is these protests.
Stephen, I definitely want to end by talking about this. But before we get to it, first of all, I want to note there is a Q&A function for anyone who would like to ask a question. I will read it to our guests, and you're welcome to start asking questions now. But I do wonder if you could just say a few words about the question that I asked before, which is why there is still, and I see this in the George Floyd protests very much, there still is a demand to live up to an idea that's been violated, whereas you did not see that in the late Soviet Union or in post-Soviet Europe.
Well, we say in the book that the Russians found it very easy to imitate, kind of create a facade capitalism, because they had created a facade communism for 20 years. I mean, they didn't really believe in it before, particularly. So that, I think, there is a way in which the ideals, the idea of party loyalty, and so many of the deep communist ideals had already been eroded. So perhaps they came into '89 without that kind of fervor, while in the U.S., I mean, the question is, how much were they hypocrisy here too? I think there is an argument of that kind, but still a living idea. But maybe Ivan would know better. So.
No, I just have a much more simple argument. Listen, the problem with the cynicism is that you cannot create community based on cynicism.
Right.
Cynicism is a very successful individual ideology. You can adjust, you can win, but you cannot have community of cynics. And from this point of view, basically at the early 1980s, a huge part of our society, in order to survive and adjust and so on, has adopted cynicism as the way of surviving. So from this point of view, the communism ended as depoliticizing society. And from this point of view, the absence of elections, the absence of any competitive politics matters, because people start to survive on their own. And this is why particularly cynicism is very difficult for the younger generation. And in the late communism, basically, nevertheless, the people, of course, they're different people. You have 10 million people in 1981 in Poland becoming members of Solidarity. So this was not a cynical people. And there is one thing about Solidarity I'm never going to forget. During this 1 year, the Solidarity moment, the consumption of alcohol in Poland went down 4 times. So people were really drunken with this kind of excitement of being together, being empowered, of being this, of being that. But there was this history, a kind of where you basically see your own leadership becoming totally cynical, not believing in what they're doing. And I do believe this was important. And also, in a strange way, the problem, we have been talking with and writing with Stephen about this, is the biggest problem of the West came that during the Cold War, you're looking at the East, and because it was a war, and because you basically fear your enemy, you're very much seeing your vulnerabilities and your weaknesses. So basically, you should try to pay attention to the working class in the West, because you're afraid that if you're not doing this, they can end up on the wrong side of the war. After basically the end of the Cold War, when the West was looking at the East, they're seeing this very much idealized view of themselves. You see basically people in the beginning, particularly in the first decade, people even now, even in places like Russia, there was something called European repair. This is about repairing apartments. So this is about quality. And for a very long period of time, when you have, for example, till 3-4 years ago, when you have some political crisis in Bulgaria, a scandal or corruption, people are going to say, listen, this never can happen in the United States or the United Kingdom. This very important thing that changed in the last 3 or 4 years is when you start to understand the things that you believe that can happen only in your side of Europe, can happen anywhere. And from this point of view, I do believe that this kind of reaction was very much mobilized by people like Orban and Kaczynski. And Orban did something which was absolutely kind of a practical demonstration of what a cynical imitation did. Very early in his first term, he came with a media legislation which was strongly attacked by everybody who was trying to restrain the media freedom in Hungary. But the European Union had a huge problem to go against this legislation because every single article of this legislation had an analog in the legislation of some of the other EU member states. So you basically assemble illiberal regime out of the parts of liberal regimes. And this is something that I do believe was particularly interesting.
I am getting some great questions here. So let me ask the first one from the journalist Mariam Lau. Can you imagine what a liberalism would look like that's less in love with itself than it was in 1989?
Well, Reinhard Niebuhr. I mean, I don't know. Yes, of course, there's a whole. I think doubt and self-critique from the beginning. The liberal ideas were about reform as a necessary part of government. I think the problem of the end of the Cold War was that you had two regimes that both were trying to create replica regimes, copies of themselves in a battle with each other. And I think the part that seems to have been an illusion was the desire that this should go on after one of the two sides basically collapsed. And America went on with this idea of replicating itself in a very naive way, as if American style of existence was natural. Again, as Ivan said, Americans didn't impose this on people. It was wanted, it was desired. But I think exactly, we end the book by saying a chastened liberalism is one that accepts the fact that history is the reign of plurality, plural forms, plural ways of organizing life. And liberalism has not been destroyed. The things that it offers have a lot to be said for it. Freedom of conscience, freedom from being tortured by your government and so forth. These are ideas that have resonance and are continue to be valuable. The freedom to criticize your government, that's not something that's going to be somehow disappeared as an appealing ideal. But the liberal hegemony, the idea that everyone has to be like us, and if they're not, there's something wrong with them. I think that was a moment in history which has gone by. Now, of course, there are many, we're seeing developments also in the United States, which I would say are clearly illiberal, non-liberal. So the question is whether or not, and those, by the way, the election of Trump was actually a revelation. It showed how corrupt American society had become, as we see that in people with Confederate flags coming out, waving Confederate flags, the anti-Semitism, that's all there. He has revealed it, he's allowed it to come forth. So these are powerful impulses that are in society, American society, that had been in a way tamped down by the Cold War and the post-Cold War consensus. They're out there now. Trump has revealed them. He's able to attack democracy itself, saying the election will be rigged. I want my opponents to be put in jail and be cheered for saying such things. So there's clearly a strong anti-democratic impulse in society. And we're going to see about how strong the antibodies are, unless someone invents a vaccine or whatever, to use that metaphor about this. But I think it's a battle. It's a battle that's called now. And it's a battle about better, to use Lincoln's phrase, about the better or the worse angels of our nature.
Stephen, can you imagine a model of liberalism that would not have the arrogance and,
Well, come on, Susan. I mean, post-World War II, we had, after World War II, we had the New Deal liberalism, which was a social compact liberalism, which is what we tried to export, let's say, to Western Germany, in which there was or that was the basic idea, that you don't leave people out, you don't want the working class to be seduced by communism and so forth. So you have Mitbestimmung and other kinds of arrangements, which you support because you're realizing that social solidarity is an important form of part of the Western anti-communist alliance. By the time of '89, you had Thatcherite, Reaganite liberalism, which goes back to your point about neoliberalism, which is a much smaller welfare state, much smaller social provision, much larger role for the market, much more naive belief that market mechanisms can solve all problems of social coordination. That form of liberalism is very brutal. That's a brutal kind. And so, yes, I can imagine it because it exists.
So I'm just trying to get Mariam's question answered as far as I possibly can. If we went back to the time before Reagan and Thatcher, would that be a vision of liberalism which you think could be revived and defended?
Listen, it's interesting because liberalism for me was also a very tragic kind of view of the world. First of all, it was quite often post-revolutionary in the French tradition, and basically Stephen was writing about Benjamin Constant. This was basically the philosophy of the people that had been shocked by certain events. It was always about tragic choices. Something that happened, and I do believe 1990s was very important for this, was this Hollywood version of liberalism, not simply on the level of the economy, but also on the level of culture. My favorite example is the film Air Force One. I don't know, have you seen the film? This is a kind of a blockbuster, but this is a kind of the new 1990s version of Antigone. There is an American president, and the terrorists basically kidnapped his family, and he should make a choice. He should either save the country or save the family. What is the choice he did? He saved both.
It's Hollywood, of course.
And I do believe this is becoming also a problem.
Americans hate
simply, it's not about economic policies only. This is also about the idea that you can expect, this is a life without the word sacrifice. Interestingly enough, somebody has written a book and showing that from 1980s, when Reagan came to power till 9/11, the word sacrifice is not present in the speeches, in any single speech of the American presidents. The word sacrifice has disappeared. You cannot ask from people to sacrifice anymore.
That's not what your country can do for you? I mean, that's
No, I mean after Reagan, from 1980 to 2001, suddenly, otherwise everybody was using, not only Kennedy, basically sacrifice was the key word for the war generation because this was basically the source of legitimacy. And then suddenly, what you cannot ask from citizens is to basically ask for sacrifice. And the liberalism started kind of a view of the world in which the governments are going to take the position of the waiters. You should simply please the client. You should please the customer. You can basically never argue against the customer. So it's not, and this was what is important about the market, because the market, much better than the state, is a position to basically respond to our individual desires. So basically it's much more individualizing. I'm saying this because it's not enough to change policies in order to revive liberalism. This is really to go back to certain understanding of the meaning of life. From this point of view, crisis like COVID-19 is an interesting. What it means about individual rights, what is about communities and so on. So I do believe we're talking about much deeper reassessment of what we do believe is a good system.
This is all true. I don't, not to be Pollyannish, but Trump said that he has done more for African Americans than any president in history, which is true, or could be true, and not in the sense he meant. And you see this by the fact that there's an awakening about these thousands of Confederate statues all around the country that are being taken down by cities, not being knocked down by mobs. People are realizing that they have statues to traitors to the country that were put up either under Jim Crow or under the reaction to Brown v. Board as a way of showing Black people in the community that they still were subordinate. And they're being taken down, just like all the young people, all the young white people who of course had cabin fever and wanted to get out and wanted to do something that was larger than themselves. And they went out on the streets, and I right here on Hudson Street, I'm in New York. They passed by the apartment every night, shouting, thank God, no, without creating a coronavirus spike so far, shouting Black Lives Matter on the streets. And this is a deep desire for something, which is a sense that, and Trump, in a way, because all of his other justifications, he didn't like free trade, or we should be protectionist, or he doesn't like American adventures abroad, or what, using all this stuff, he's been really boiled down to the racist core of what he believes. And therefore, it shocked people, because once the covering has gone away, once all of his hypocrisy has been stripped away, and it's really just about the white people whose superiority has been challenged, people don't want to live in that world. And I don't say doesn't mean necessarily there's a kind of naive, principled humanism that's taken over the country, but there's something going on like this. And you see it in this reaction to those damned Confederate statues.
Stephen, I would love to go on about this. I am glad you're feeling as hopeful as I am. I'm feeling very hopeful right now. But I have 3 very good questions, and I want to give people a chance to ask them. So let me start with another of our board members, the sociologist Eva Illouz. I will just read what Eva has written. Some countries are very happy to imitate other countries because the imitation gives them an aura of respectability and political legitimacy. Israel, for example, was eager to imitate or claim to imitate the West. Can you say what must happen in a society for this glamour of imitation to cease? When does the object of imitation start to appear as an uninvited and intrusive foreigner?
This is a great question, and I'm very grateful for this, because one of the things that really kind of fascinates me these days is to try to see that now when you have this major kind of a crisis of liberal democracy, and we're talking about the liberals whom they also not imitate, they imitate. But to be honest, they don't imitate Trump, and they don't imitate Putin. If there is a political leader and basically political projects that people like Kaczynski and Orban are really fascinated with, it is Israel. And this is the kind of success of imitation when you become a model itself. And this is interesting because in a certain way, the Israeli type of nationalism was very much born at the same time when the East European anti-Semitic nationalism, but Israel achieved what all this small East European nationalism in the interwar period was really longing for. You have a very successful economy, you're a nuclear power, you're much more influential than you are. You're a democracy, but you're basically an ethnic democracy at the same time. So for me, this is quite interesting to see that the end of imitation, at least in our view, does not mean that basically countries stop imitate each other or political leaders. What stopped to be imitated was the idea of liberal democracy as the universal model, because you're imitating it, not simply because you like it, but because you believe this is the future. And I do believe, strangely enough, we're in this kind of a post-universalist model in where you're imitating certain things because basically it much more works for you or appeal and so on. But in order to be successful, you should become the model. So in order basically the imitation to work, at some point you can declare that you are the model.
Would you agree?
I think, well, one simple answer is, what does it take for the glamour of imitation to disappear? 2008 is the simple answer. That was one of the things that really took the shine off the Western model. On the other hand, I think these protests in the US put the shine back on the Western model in some way. So this is a kind of thing. But of course, we were very inspired by our friend Ken Jowett, who has written about imitating facades. So like in the 18th century, where you had I think the Elector of Brandenburg built a castle called Versailles. You imitate the powerful because you're trying to be legible to the powerful. And I think maybe some of these German potentates actually had a mistress, even though they didn't sleep with her, because the Louis XV had a mistress, so he had to have one too. Imitating the powerful is a way just to survive in an environment. That's fake imitation. So our point about the drama of Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, was there was a sense of conversion. There was a belief that those societies could become, not just put up a facade like they did in Russia, not just have fake elections that look like elections, but really become democratic. And even though that's, of course, much more admirable, the sincerity of it was palpable, it also has, it produced some difficulties that we point out, particularly the difficulty of being integrated into the European Union, where while you were told that you were becoming a democracy, all your laws were being written in Brussels. So this was a kind of a contradiction that made the democratization project problematic in the eyes of, well, a large group of people who lived in those countries.
So our staff member, sociologist Misha Gabovich, asks the following: what's next? It would be nice to think that a drawn-out period of community-crushing cynicism will lead to a new wave of community-building idealism, and there's some indications of that happening. But what I'm seeing among many younger people in Russia is more complex. Strongly held values in their own lives, coupled with cynicism as a catch-all explanation of whatever is going on in the world. What's your take on this?
I'll just go on the Russian case, and and I do believe one thing that is basically totally going to change is the new wave of liberalism is not going to be the one being the liberalization in just westernization of society. And it's going to be much more rooted in the idea of the national pride than it was. If you see all these people, this is interesting. If you see, for example, the politicians in Central and Eastern Europe who identified themselves as liberals and who did well, for example, the Slovak president who was recently elected, she does not speak English. Strangely enough, this was a different idea of what is liberalism, and for them, liberalism came much more as the experience of what illiberal regimes that they had been living in. So from this point of view, it's not about being like others. It's very much, liberalism is going to be told as a story of something that we discovered for ourselves, that is part of our tradition. We don't want to be judged by ourselves. And I do believe from this point of view, you can see that nevertheless, that you're going to have a liberal alternative, liberal politicians and so on, they're going to be very different than the first generation that was speaking the language of normalization and being like the West. Even more, I do believe that, and in the case of Russia with Herzen and others, you have this tradition that in a certain way, liberalism should be kind of a reconciled to how, basically, to the Russian tradition. It's not simply about destroying this tradition.
Stephen, what do you have to say about it?
I would say the biggest, I don't know if this is exactly, because I didn't quite understand the question, but the biggest challenge I think we're facing is that behind the liberal versus anti-liberal conflict is a strong geographical split between urban and rural areas. And the fact is that there's a resentment on the part of people who are outside the big metropolitan areas of people like us who live in cities and who have friends all around the world. And partly it's because everybody seeks some kind of homogeneity in their life. And of course, our homogeneity is we like to be around people who've seen the same movies and like the same concerts and so read the same books that we do and so forth. That's a homogeneity. We don't care what passport you have or what color your skin is particularly. That's not so important. And then we look at people who live locally, whose information networks are all small groups or the social media that they like. And they don't have that form. They don't have, because I would say education is the, or like say, sort of universalism is the particularism of the highly educated, something like that. And it is, and it feels like we can look down on people who seek other forms of homogeneity that aren't ours because look at their prejudice. They have ethnic, they believe in only fraternizing with people of their same ethnicity or something. So I think this is a split which is very hard to overcome, particularly in a democracy where everyone's voting. And I feel it's very hard. You can't for people like us to sympathize with the deplorables is not that easy to do. And I don't want to, actually, to tell you the truth, I don't want to sympathize with them. But I it doesn't mean I don't understand what their resentment is about, because they view our sense of superiority as somewhat hypocritical, in the sense that we just are advertising how comfortable we are in a multi-ethnic environment, multinational environment. But that's because we all went to the same university or whatever it was, which is a kind of unfair, I would say, from their point of view. So I would say that is a big problem, which I don't see how to solve. And I think it's everywhere behind these new waves of anti-liberalism. So the future, without that bridge, unless you can create a system, and this was Kaczynski's genius, and if a liberal forces, and maybe this guy Trzaskowski or whatever his name is, if liberal forces can actually imitate what Kaczynski did, which was do something to show your respect for ordinary people who live outside the cities, give them a subsidy, show that they matter. In the U.S., the Democrats have not found an idiom really with which they can speak even to the voters for Trump, and that I'm not going to offer it because I don't have it either. But I think that's the key problem.
I think that is both a deep point and a bon mot. Universalism is the particularism of the highly educated. I want to try to read this question that I mangled because I combined it with Misha's question before. This is someone I don't know, Sabina Zergel. How can liberalism achieve social and racial justice? I'll shorten this a bit. Wouldn't it be time to think real alternatives politically? Wasn't that the original sin of '89, that we failed to think about political alternatives, particularly on questions of centuries of colonialism, as well as the climate crisis? Anybody want to give us a try at that one?
Listen, well, this is a big question. And of course, this was one of the problems, and there is no alternative. Was one of the major policy line of 1989, and this is why all these parties, both from the left and from the right, they're going to talk about the alternative. And liberalism normally was about alternatives, and I very much agree that probably this is one of the way. But there is now a central kind of a problem in the way we talk about this universalism and what we see today. Listen, universalism believes that nevertheless that you can sympathize or not sympathize with somebody, you can put yourself in his or her shoes. Nevertheless, how different these shoes are. Because it is exactly because I can put myself in your shoes, I respect all of us as a human beings, and this is why you can keep me accountable for what I'm doing. This is why you can ask me, you should not offend me. If you believe that I can never understand your experience because this is very different, because of gender, of race, of nationality, I don't know what, then it's very difficult to keep people accountable and responsible for what they're doing. If I cannot understand you, I don't know what really offends you. And I do believe from this point of view, we see a lot of activism these days, but honestly speaking, also what you see in the US and other places, it's a post-universalism type of activism. It's about a very strong identity politics, which is easy to be explained, but then you should come with something inclusive. And part of the failure of liberalism after 1989 was so much focus on individual that trying to talk about inclusive idea of society was very much ignored. This is why came national populists who said, listen, you're not alone, we're here. Society is not a school, society is a family, and probably we're not so smart like the liberals, but at least we're not going to run away. And I do believe this is a huge issue, and this is going to become an issue exactly when you try to define this as a political alternative. How to make an inclusive project out of all this passionate identity politics that you see there. It's not enough for them to vote together. The problem is how they can shape a society together.
I actually think we're in a post-universalist moment, Ivan, but that's a subject for another discussion. I have a final question from Sigve Tonstad, who says they get the problem of uncritical imitation, but feels that your under projecting political leaders' use of resentment to build political support, people like Orban, etc. There is genuine disappointment, but there are also power-grabbing opportunists. So the problem is not only the disappointment with a flawed liberal West, but our legitimate disappointment with them. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I mean, definitely populism has produced its share of disappointment, and it's going to. And so our argument is never that populism is going to inherit the earth or that liberalism is doomed to be defeated. Not at all. But one thing is for certain, that Orban's not popular because he's a kleptocrat. That's not the reason people support him. There's something else he's offering, and that is he speaks to some sense of being left behind, some sense of being that the meritocratic ideal. Let's take our friends at Central European University. Basically, the idea that the best university in Hungary is one they can't go to. This is was an irritant, and he was able to play on that. And I mean, you can't the kleptocracy, which is obviously appalling, doesn't explain it. And the proof is that, say, Kaczynski, even though people around Kaczynski may be corrupt, Kaczynski himself is not corrupt. So and they have the same kind of nationalist appeal to people and the same kind of politics of resentment and grievance without the corruption. So I completely, of course, agree that the main dynamic of the Hungarian regime is kleptocratic, but the legitimacy is a different thing.
So we have gone on just somewhat longer than we said we would. It doesn't surprise me. Normally in the Einstein Forum, we go in for a long, lovely, intense discussion. So we still have programs for you until we shut down this program for the summer and hope to begin live in the fall. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Stephen and Ivan. I know that there's still questions left. I have been being asked questions about this book. I've even attended entire dinner parties in Berlin, devoted to discussing your book. So I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk about it here.